So we'll begin. Today's shiur is dedicated to Rav Avram Yitzchak Cohen Kook. Today is his yahretzeit, Gimel Elul. Many of you know that I have a great love and appreciation for Rav Kook. In my opinion, he is without a doubt one of, or maybe the most important Jewish thinker of the last century or two. And his teachings have had a profound impact on Jewish history these last several decades, especially here in Israel. I was first exposed to the teachings of Rav Kook when I came to Israel to study after college, after I got married, and I was immediately taken in by them. In the religious Zionist community here in Israel, Rav Kook's name and face is everywhere. You see it everywhere, and you see it on buildings, you see it in books, you see it in the newspapers. His picture, I have a picture of Rav Kook in my own home, and excerpts from his teachings, quotes from his teachings, often adorn the walls of schools and yeshivot. So if you go to my son's, what will be his high school, they have framed quotes from Rav Kook's teachings, because that's how central he is. In America, there are those who recognize Rav Kook's name, certainly those at Cedar Sinai who heard me speak or teach, heard me mention it more than once. But in America, few know more than the name. They know he's an important rabbi. Maybe they know he was the chief rabbi of Israel before the state. Maybe they know he has these very spiritual, inspired teachings. But in America, they don't usually know much more than that. And interestingly enough, even here in Israel, it's not so different, because here he's more of a mythic figure than a flesh and blood historical figure. And this is actually well attested to by the simple fact that maybe the most popular biography of Rav Kook is titled An Angel Among Men, right? Because Rav Kook sort of looked at it that way. He's an angel. He's sort of above us, beyond us. We're all kind of looking up to him. But when you look at somebody as an angel and not a human being, obviously it's sort of hard to get a feel for who they really were. It can be said that very few rabbis have changed the course of Jewish history, but Rav Kook is on that small list of those whose impact on Jewish life is undeniable. And you really can't understand Israel today, I would say, particularly the religious Zionist community, but Israel as a whole, without understanding Rav Kook's teachings, without appreciating what they were and what they mean and how they continue to impact life here. In a simple way, I'll just say, at a time in the late 19th, early 20th century, when Orthodoxy's relationship to Zionism was ambivalent at best, Rav Kook's embrace of Zionism basically dragged the Orthodox community kicking and screaming to become Zionists, right? He, through the sheer force of will of his teachings and Torah, brought Zionism to a much, much broader Jewish world. For me, the light of Rav Kook's teachings had such an impact that they really nourished our dream of Aliyah during the more than the decade that we lived in America. And in addition to today being Rav Kook's yahretzeit, it's also our Yom Aliyah. Today is the day of our anniversary of when we came to Israel 3 years ago. And a Yom Aliyah is something that people celebrate, right? It's sort of a joyous day, the day that you finally came here to stay here. And the fact that our Yom Aliyah coincides with the yahretzeit of Rav Kook is something that is deeply meaningful to me on a personal level. And I take great pride knowing that our return here to the land of Israel is forever joined with the neshama, the soul of Rav Kook. So the topic I want us to explore today is one that was very dear to Rav Kook, and it's what's called Torat Eretz Yisrael, or translated as the Torah of the land of Israel. I don't know if you've encountered this expression before. It's not actually original to Rav Kook. It appears also in Chazal, which we'll see in a moment, but Rav Kook developed it in very significant and important ways, this idea of a Torah of the land of Israel. And the reason the idea is unique or significant, I'll just point out, is because normally we don't associate the Torah with any particular geographical area. In fact, one of the very significant things about the narrative of the Exodus is that the Torah was not given in the land of Israel, right? The Torah was given at Har Sinai, Midbar Sinai, in the desert, in the no man's land, basically between Egypt and Israel. right? So we don't typically associate the Torah with a place, and if anywhere, it's not necessarily in Israel. So then we're left wondering exactly what is this Torah of the land of Israel, if the Torah was given at Har Sinai. So one thing I'll point out is that when you look in Sefer Yeshaya in the book of Isaiah, what becomes clear is this idea that while the Torah was revealed to the Jewish people at Har Sinai, there will be a second revelation of the Torah, so to speak, in the land of Israel, right? There's a famous verse from Yeshaya that we all know, Ki mitzion tetzei Torah, because Torah goes forth from Zion, right? From Zion, from Israel, from Jerusalem, right? So this idea of a Torah, revelation of Torah from the land of Israel, it comes from the Nevi'im, and it's really a messianic Torah, a future Torah. And Rav Kook really emphasizes this through his development of the idea of a Torah of the land of Israel. So I want us to look at a couple of texts briefly that sort of lay out what is this idea of a Torah of the land of Israel, because as I said, it's not necessarily obvious or intuitive. And then we'll see how Rav Kook develops it. We'll look and see what some of the problems with his approach might be and how we might be able to address it even today. So this idea of a Torah of the land of Israel gets developed in the Midrash based on a verse from Bereshit, from the second parak of Bereshit, parak bet, V'zahava aretz hahi, tov sham, abdolach ve'evin hashoham. This is actually a verse describing the Garden of Eden. And what it says is that the gold of the land is good, bdellium is there, and lapish lazuli. So we have to understand what this verse is referring to. So the first thing I'll say is that when the Torah describes the Garden of Eden, it notes that it is overflowing with wonderful, precious things. Because it has water, it has plenty of water, it has multiple rivers, it has numerous fruit-bearing trees, all the things that a person might need. It's basically there at one's fingertips. But what the Torah also says, interestingly enough, is that the Garden of Eden was also filled with precious jewels and metals, which seems a bit excessive. Like, why did Adam and Chava need precious jewels and metals? But it clearly is the Torah's way of saying how special the Garden of Eden was. Every element of it was just overflowing with goodness, even the things that human beings might not necessarily need, but at the very least would find aesthetically pleasing or beautiful. What's interesting is the way the Midrash takes this idea that there's gold in the land, the gold in the land of the Garden of Eden. So here's how the Midrash Rabbah explains it. It cites that verse once again. It was the Hava Aretz Hahitov, Milamed she'ein Torah ki Torat Eretz Yisrael, velo chokhmah ke chokhmat Eretz Yisrael. The gold of the land is good. In this case, clearly a reference to the land of Israel. And this teaches there is no Torah like the Torah of the land of Israel, and there is no wisdom like the wisdom of the land of Israel. So what the Midrash seems to be saying, we'll unpack it, is that there's something special about the Torah that is discovered, learned, revealed in Israel, right? Something that differentiates it from Torah that might be experienced or explored anywhere else, right? I love this expression here in the Midrash. There's just ain't nothing like it, right? You just can't compare it. There's just something about it that's maybe we can't even put into words, but it's clearly special and unique. So to understand the Midrash properly, we just have to understand that it's doing two things. It's making two comparisons. First, it equates Gan Eden to the land of Israel. The two are one. And this is an idea that's all over the many different rabbinic midrashim, right? That the land of, or I should say, the Garden of Eden was literally in the land of Israel. And the association makes sense, because if the Garden of Eden is supposed to be like a paradise, we'd expect it to be, and it's somewhere around here, then we'd expect the land of Israel to be a logical place for it. The land of Israel is also, as we know, the Holy Land, the land flowing with milk and honey, right? So this idea of Israel being a place of abundance and the Garden of Eden being a place of abundance, those ideas go together. And to a certain extent, the rabbis are saying to live in Israel, the land of Israel, is to be in Gan Eden. That's the first part of the Midrash. The second part of the Midrash is to say that the gold found in Gan Eden, right, the gold literally in the land, what that really is, that gold, is Torah. Right, that's what is ultimately what is precious that is found here. And again, Torah is a very, very big idea. I didn't bring it, but I should have. There's one of my favorite quotes from somebody who was close to Rav Kook. His name was, he was a great Hebrew author, writer. Azar was his sort of nickname. He made Aliyah in early 20th century. He was close to Rav Kook. So he has this line that he says, Israel's not like California. We didn't move to Israel because there's gold in those hills. We went there to repair the tears in our souls. And I love that quote for a lot of reasons, but you can see how it's relevant here, right? When the Torah is saying there's gold in the land and the way the rabbis are understanding it as relating to Israel, right? What makes Israel precious is not the material wealth here. It's something much deeper than that. It's the Torah that actually helps us rectify, repair, fix the deepest parts of ourselves. And that's something about what the Torah of the land of Israel is ultimately all about. So Rav Kook talks about this idea of the Torah of the land of Israel in many places. There's a collection of his teachings called Orot Torah, which are dedicated to his thoughts, reflections on the nature of Torah, Torah study. And one of the chapters there is actually dedicated to this idea of Torat Eretz Yisrael. And there's many teachings in other parts of his writings that express it. I wanted to bring you just one quote from it to kind of give you a sense of how Rav Kook thinks about the Torah of the land of Israel, and specifically this idea that it's a redemptive Torah. That's very, very important for Rav Kook. Torah of the land of Israel has many dimensions for him. It's prophetic, it's spiritual, it unifies, it brings together all the different dimensions of Torah into one, right? Instead of different parts of Torah being contradictory, they all become unified through Torat Eretz Yisrael. But here, he really emphasizes this idea of a redemptive Torah. It's transformative on all those who come close to its light. So the citation here, it opens by highlighting a rabbinic teaching, and the rabbinic teaching is comparing basically the Torah of the land of Israel to the Torah of Babylonia, right? The two competing centers during late antiquity were Jews in land of Israel and Jews in Babylonia. And we know that the Jews of Babylonia ultimately became ascended. That's why we study the Talmud Bavli and not as much the Talmud Yerushalmi. But even so, the Talmud Bavli records this teaching, which in ways is critical of itself, right? That the Talmud Bavli, the Jews of Babylonia, the Torah of Babel is lacking. And the rabbinic teaching is, again, citing a verse here, that basically in darkness you have caused me to dwell. That's what the verse says. And the rabbis explain this is the Talmud Bavli, right? The Babylonian Talmud, it means to be dwelling in darkness in some way because it is ultimately reflective of exile, right? And for Rav Kook, the Talmud Bavli is in some ways less spiritual than the Talmud Yerushalmi. It's more logical or rational in certain sense. But the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Torah of the land of Israel, has this advantage, right? Because if the Babylonian Talmud is ultimately expression of darkness, the Torah of the land of Israel is an expression of light. So I'll go on to explain how he understands it. He says, even though the Babylonian Talmud is this experience of darkness, he says, however, out of the darkness, a great light will grow. The people that tread in darkness will see the great light. A light will shine upon those who dwell in the land of the shadow of death, because they cause the illumination of the Shekhinah to descend to the lower paths of light and illuminate the many dark alleyways. But the Torah of the land of Israel will shine a light, and all those Jews out there who are in darkness are going to see that light, and they're going to be drawn to it. And the source of that light of the Torah of the land of Israel is the fact that Shekhinah, God's presence, has been brought down to earth. That's what's going to infuse the Torah and cause it to shine. Rav Kook goes on, he says, it will give strength to the many who are distant so that they should come closer and connect to the supernal light of the splendor of the essence of Torah that is the Torah of the land of Israel. And he concludes with the rabbinic midrash we just read, the gold of the land is good. There is no Torah like the Torah of the land of Israel, and there is no wisdom like the wisdom of the land of Israel. So the metaphor here is quite powerful, at least for me, right? The Torah of the land of Israel is going to shine its light, and all those Jews that are dwelling in darkness, they're going to see the light and they're going to be drawn to the light, like moths to a flame, right? If you've been living your whole life in darkness and suddenly you see up on the horizon a burst of light, right? You're going to feel drawn to it. You're going to want to go towards it. And that's exactly what this redemptive Torat Eretz Yisrael is going to do. It's going to shine its light and it's going to bring Jews to it, right? This is when we think of it in a redemptive sense, right? This idea of the ingathering of the exiles, right? The source of that and the metaphor here is the light of the Torah of the land of Israel. It's going to draw people in. That's what it does. Because again, there's no Torah like the Torah of the land of Israel. So for Rav Kook and his redemptive vision of Zionism, right? At the heart of this is this rejuvenation of Torah that will shine its light, a light that shines forth from the land of Israel. Kimitzion Tetzei Torah, literally from Zion, from Jerusalem, from the it will draw Jews to it. They can't help but be drawn to it. So that's Rav Kook's understanding of the redemptive nature of Torat Eretz Yisrael. But there's another element that goes along with it that's very, very significant for him. And that is the idea that what Torat Eretz Yisrael will do is allow the past to be rejuvenated and brought into the present, right? Instead of feeling like we live in a modern world in which the past is very distant from us, that we can't relate to it, that we think back to the lives of our great-grandparents or even just our grandparents, and they seem so different from anything that we know, right? That we live a life, maybe even with different values and perspectives that are just so foreign to them. Rav Kook believed that what the Torah of the land of Israel was going to do was rejuvenate the past and bring it into the present, to make there be continuity where there had only been a feeling of disconnect. And this is very, very significant because he really sees this as the heart of the Zionist endeavor, right? Zionism is about bringing the Jews back to the land of Israel, but what it's also about is transforming the Torah, the Jewish tradition, to bring it into the future as well. For Rav Kook, 2,000 years in exile has not done wonders for the Torah and for the Jewish people, but coming back to the land of Israel creates that possibility for renewal, for transformation. And he has in one of his letters the most beautiful expression of this, about how, I'll give away the best line, right? This is maybe the most famous line of all of Rav Kook's teachings. He says, the old will become new and the new will become holy. Hayashan yitchadesh v'achadash yitkadesh. I want to unpack what this means, but you can already understand just what it's getting at, right? There's something about the Torah of the land of Israel that is going to transform the past, bring it into the present, make it new, but in doing so also make it holy. So this particular letter where he says this was written to a close student of his, Moshe Seidel, who was also a professor at Yeshiva University, if I remember correctly. And he is laying out here of Kook his vision for the rejuvenation, the renewal that Zionism is going to bring about. And what's important is that Rav Kook sees it as a cultural renewal and a national renewal. Within the history of Zionism, there was sort of two competing streams, those who wanted to focus on Jewish culture and the renewal of Jewish culture, and those who wanted to focus on the building of like a Jewish settlement and a state ultimately in the land of Israel, more of a political focus versus those of a cultural focus. But Rav Kook sees both of those goals as being fundamentally one. It's all about the old will become new and the new will become holy. So I'll just read you a little bit of the letter here because you see how he gets at it. And again, for him, this is what Torat Eretz Yisrael is all about. He says here, and this was written, I want to say relatively early on, maybe before 1910 or so. Rav Kook himself, born in 1865, dies in 1935, moves to Israel in 1904, and that's really where his teachings in Torah takes off. And this was written some point after 1904. So here's what he says. He says, writing to his student in describing the Zionist endeavor, our independent culture, of which no our national revival in the Holy Land that is destined to be a vision of worlds is one faithful dream. As I said, the renewal of Jewish culture and the renewal of the Jewish nation, it's all one dream, even though oftentimes people think of them as competing. It is only in error do they appear as two contradictory and opposing systems. We must begin, so how is this going to take place? We must begin with the foundation of literature. Rav Kook was a great lover of literature because that's what Torah is. Torah is literature, new, old. That we have to find a way to rejuvenate what is Jewish literature, which is Torah, so that it doesn't turn their back on so that one doesn't turn their back on the past. Rather, one harnesses the new to come to know the depths of the good of the past and how the new goes alongside it and always completes it, right? By knowing the new, by knowing the world that you live in, and to a certain extent, understanding its values and its truths, that actually allows you to go back into the past, into the old, and understand it and actually bring it forward. And recognizing that the old and new are not meant to be in conflict, even though they always feel like they are, that the old and new are supposed to ultimately mean to complement each other. And this, I'll just give you an example. For Rav Kook, this was a very visceral experience, this conflict between old and new, because it really was at the heart of the conflict between religious and secular around the Zionist enterprise. The religious, the Orthodox, for the most part, did not embrace Zionism. They thought it was a mistake. They thought it was a great theological error or a sin. And the secular, the new, so to speak, they thought it was, the future. And this disconnect, this tension between the religious and secular is very much a disconnect between the old and the new. And for Rav Kook's generation, it was a literal conflict between parents and children. You had these parents who were religious, deeply religious, Orthodox, European, whose children, when they got of age, basically abandoned religious observance to embrace secular Zionism. So this tension between old and new is literally a family tension, a family drama between parents and children in his own time, right? And where better do we see the conflict between old and new than between parents and children? Like, we all experience that. We all know that, right? It's at the heart of it. But for Rav Kook, his vision is that parents and children don't have to fight. They don't have to be in conflict. There can be a vision of true tradition in which it's passed down from one generation to the other. But in doing so, the old doesn't stay old. The old ultimately becomes transformed. The old becomes new, and the new becomes holy. And as he concludes here, and together they will become flaming torches upon Zion, right? This metaphor of the old and the new becoming new and the holy, and it's shining that light, right? Because that's what Torat Eretz Yisrael does. That's his vision for the renewal of Torah as part of the Zionist enterprise. And I love this letter. I love this quote because for me, it's been such a guiding principle in my own life, in the rabbinate. When I was at the shul, I mean, you all know, right? When we merged 3 synagogues into one, right? And we tried to create something new, that's exactly what we were doing. We were saying the old will become new. These synagogues with this tremendous history, tradition, legacy, but it can't stay in the past forever. It has to be brought into the present so that it can have a future, which means that old is going to have to become new. But at the same time, we don't lose the old because the old is the only way we can have holiness. So again, this idea has been very central to my own, professional work as a rabbi, but at the same time, also in my personal life, as somebody who has always drawn great inspiration, spiritual inspiration from the past, even from my own personal and family past. I want to give you a story because I think it illustrates both the power of Torat Eretz Yisrael and the challenges. It has to do with our own family's, personal history, and I know my parents are on, so I think they'll appreciate this. When I was quite young, I think I was 4 years old, my family took a visit to cousins of ours who lived in Brooklyn, and they were Satmar Hasidim. These were cousins of my father's side. We visited Rabbi Yisrael Steinberger, who was a cousin, like I said, of my father. He himself was a Holocaust survivor. He had been born and raised in Munkash in Hungary, as most of my father's side of the family had been. And my parents took me and to go spend time with Rabbi Steinberger and his daughter and his family. And it was a very special visit for all of us. And what was at the heart of that visit was this attempt to reconnect to the past, because that part of the family, especially after the Holocaust, it was hard to really know who they were and where they had come from and what they had been through. My grandmother was born in Europe, but she made it to America before the war. So we had some sense of what was there, but not the full sense. And spending time with him was part of the way of connecting with that. And of course, he's a Satmar Chassid. He was a rabbi. He was a Rosh Kollel. He was very learned. He was a Talmid Chacham. When you're a 4-year-old and you're encountering somebody in the Hasidic levush, in the Hasidic garb, it makes an impact on you. And I really remember being in that apartment and just being very much leaving behind very much an indelible memory for me. And we know childhood memories have a power to them that is difficult to put into words, because most of what we experience when we're young, we forget, but the things that stick with us are usually something important. And the memories that linger are significant. And that visit for me was always very much so that way, even though I was quite young. So it wasn't like I remembered what was going on there, but just the experience of it was always very significant for me. But what's fascinating is when I was older, I think it was when I'd come to Israel to study Torah, at some point I ended up bringing it up with my parents about that visit and how it had been meaningful. And I think in part because I was studying some Hasidus at the time, and I knew that we had these Hasidic roots, and I was curious if the family knew more about it. And my parents told me that Rabbi Steinberger had written a letter to us back then, all those years ago, outlining the family history. And in it, he talked about my, I think, great-great-great-great-grandfather, Rabbi Shlomo Gross, who was a rabbi and a chassid, and very close with the first Rebbe of Munkash, also known as the Bnei Yissaschar of Tzvi Elimelech Shapiro of Dinav, very important Hasidic rabbi, and my ancestor was a very, very close student of his. And the letter really made a point of emphasizing that and the family history and the Hasidic yichus. And what was very clear was how much Rabbi Steinberger wanted to convey to us just that family past, where we had come from, and the fact that it was still very much relevant to us today. And he wanted to emphasize Rabbi Shlomo Gross, my ancestor, was very pious, very humble. He was admired for these things. He was a dayan in Munkash. He wasn't just a rabbi. He himself was like a rabbinic judge, a rabbinic leader. These were all very significant. So I found that letter very, very moving and inspiring, but there was a problem, at least for me, because Munkash Hasidim were virulently anti-Zionist, meaning they oppose Zionism in the most extreme sense, right? If you're familiar with Satmar Hasidim, not liking Zionism in Israel, so Munkash Hasidim are right alongside of them. In fact, Munkash and Satmar were sort of in a competition to see who could be most extreme about everything, and the Munkash Rebbe and the Satmar Rebbe hated each other, so it was just one of those things. But when I was living in Israel, getting this inspiration from this Hasidic, Munkash background, I kept thinking to myself, I'm a Zionist, I'm a religious Zionist. What would my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather think of me, having embraced Zionism after all these years? And what I would do is there's a Munkash Beit Midrash in Nachlaot, one of the neighborhoods in Jerusalem, by Machane Yehuda, by the Shuk, and I would pass it. And I'd think to myself, what would the Hasidim in there think of me, right? Our family comes from this, but again, we're Zionists, we're religious Zionists. It's so different. And that, I think, is the challenge with this idea of Torat Eretz Yisrael. We want the old to become new and the new to become holy, but it's not always so easy to do that because, as I said, the past and the present often feel so disconnected from each other. Rav Kook, I think, was sensitive to this, but maybe didn't always appreciate how hard it is to achieve this. And to sort of flesh this out, I want us to turn to another very important rabbinic thinker for me, and that is Rav Shigar, important Israeli theologian, philosopher, Rosh Yeshiva, who very much also considered himself a student of the teachings of Rav Kook. Rav Shigar died about 15 years ago. Rav Shigar was very sensitive to this challenge of trying to make the old new and the new holy, right? Because what Rav Shigar recognized is that Zionism did do this in a lot of ways, even secular Zionism. It made the old new and the new holy, but it often did it by rejecting many parts of the Jewish tradition. It transformed Judaism, it made it new, but it only could do it by saying, okay, there's all these parts of it we don't like, we have to get rid of it. And that's a challenge because that's not really what Rav Kook had in mind. Rav Kook did not believe that the Torah we're going to cut out half the parts of the Torah to make it new and make it holy. That wasn't what he meant. And in fact, I'll give you just an example of this. In our synagogue, I don't know if it's still there used to be a flag on the bima for the military base Chavat HaShomer, Israeli military base. It was part of our Zionism. We had the flag on the bima next to other flags. And on that flag, the base, where it said, Bizchut ha'emunah be'adam, through the merit of faith in human beings. And if you don't know rabbinic texts, you might not catch what's going on there. Superficially, what it means is we're an army, we have trust in each other, we have faith in each other, and it's our faith in each other as soldiers that gives us our strength, and that's how we overcome. That would, I think, be the straightforward reading, but it's also clearly a play on a rabbinic teaching, because the rabbis say, Bizchut ha'emunah b'Hashem niga'alu b'nei Yisrael miMitzrayim, right? It's through the merit of faith in God that the Jewish people were redeemed from Egypt. Whereas the secular Zionist transformation of that idea is through the merit of having faith in human beings that we're going to basically be victorious. And that's the way secular Zionism often works. It makes the old new, but it does it by cutting out parts of the past. And if you cut out parts of the past, if you excise it, you can make the old new, but you can't necessarily make the new holy. And that is the real challenge. How do we make the old new and make the new holy? And I'll give you just a brief example of this. Because again, I think most religious Zionists today think they've done it. We've solved it. We've transformed things. But they don't always realize how difficult it is. And Rav Shigar, in one of his essays, reflects on this around the tefillot of Yom HaAtzmaut, the prayer service for Yom HaAtzmaut. And if you're familiar with it, the prayer service we recite on Yom HaAtzmaut night is something sort of unusual. If I had to come up with a word for it, maybe this sounds a little disrespectful, but I might call it a Frankenstein. Because what it is a combination of all these different elements from different liturgies, from different holidays that get combined into one. So it's like a little this and a little bit of that. And we put it all together to make this new service of Yom HaAtzmaut night. But the problem is, if you're familiar with these tefillot from all the other traditional places, to suddenly have them all be put together here is a bit jarring, right? It's almost like out of place. What are we doing here? It feels a bit artificial. And that's the challenge, right? The prayer service of Yom HaAtzmaut is an attempt to make the old new, right? We're going to create this new holiday, which we also believe is rooted in tradition and Jewish values, celebrating the state. And we're trying to borrow from Torah, from different texts. But even still, it's not so hard to make the old new. Right, so here's what Rav Kook says, and he says, Rav Shigar says, he says, in practice, the prayers service of Yom HaAtzmaut is a collection of prayers from different times of the year. You'll find in it chapters of Psalms, the prayer L'chadodi from Kabbalat Shabbat, which are appropriate, of course, for the essence of the day, right? We kind of get why we're having L'chadodi type prayers. It's celebratory. The concluding prayers of Yom Kippur are included in it. The Misha Asa Nisim of Rosh Chodesh. All of this is recited in the tune of Yom Tov, with the Zionist edition of Shir HaMalot to the melody of Hatikva, right? All these different elements being tied together. What was the nervous to organize it like this, right? All these different parts from all these different places. Its artificiality is grating on the Jewish ear that is accustomed to the consistency of other prayer services throughout the year. Now, Rav Shigar says this as a deeply, deeply committed religious Zionist. He believes in Yom HaAtzmaut. He believes in it in the most deeply religious fashion. But he's pointing out something kind of obvious. When you look at that service, when you encounter it for the first time, it's quite strange. And it's like, what exactly are we trying to do here by putting all these pieces together? And it's a challenge. And Rav Shigar goes on to say, because the reason it's so challenging is that the tradition gets its sense of holiness from it feeling like it's connected to the past authentically. But when we don't feel like we're connected to the past authentically, when we can kind of see the hand of the editors who've kind of created something new, when it doesn't necessarily feel natural, it's hard for it then to feel holy, this new creation that we've put together. Rav Shigar says it's the aura of sacred memory that is not subject to change by being disconnected from the present. The way that we think about tradition is that it doesn't change, right? So the moment you start changing it, it doesn't always feel like tradition anymore, which is a real challenge. Following it, any attempt, even one that is justified, to introduce a new practice, which is not rooted in the same memory, that collective historical memory of tradition, is destined to failure because it is not able to establish itself in the past. Right? He's basically pointing out Rav Kook's challenge. Right? If you're going to make the old new, you got to do it in an authentic way, and that's really hard. Even the Tefillah and Yom HaAtzmaut, which attempt to do that, don't quite achieve it. And what Rav Shigar does is he sets as religious Zionism's goal, again, this goal of Torat Eretz Yisrael, to make the old new and the new holy. He says, if religious Zionism is in fact a partner in Zionism's purpose to return the Jew to the historical reality of a land and home, as well as in the religious dimension, to bring the Shekhinah to the earth in order for it to be part of the historical events of the Jewish people, of the Jewish people's experience in the present, the prayers of Yom HaAtzmaut come and prove how difficult this is. Meaning, if Rav Kook's great vision was, as I keep saying, to make the old new and the new holy, we may think that it's possible. We want to believe it's possible. But then we look at the prayer service of Yom HaAtzmaut and we realize it's really, really hard. It's really hard to take the past and take from it without, again, compromising its integrity, to allow it to still feel holy. And even, as I said, oftentimes when we take from the past, that often means we're throwing away or rejecting or cutting out all the parts from the past we don't like. And that also just, it doesn't feel like it's holy then with what we are left with. So this is the question. This is the main question of Torat Eretz Yisrael. How do we do this? How do we make the old new and the new holy? So I want to suggest one possibility from one of Rav Kook's other letters, a letter to his son. It's a very interesting letter. He writes this to his son, Rav Tzvi Kook, who also became a great rabbi. It's one of the earlier letters that we have. And in it, Rav Kook is giving basically advice to his son about learning. You know, when you're in yeshiva, when you're focused on learning, what should be your approach? What should be your orientation? And what he emphasizes to his son is this idea that you have to do what's known as chazara. You have to do repetition. You have to keep learning and learning and learning the same thing over and over and over again to really understand it. It's a fascinating thing we do as Jews, that we never learn anything just once, right? In the most basic sense, we read the Torah every calendar year, which means every year we read the same parsha over and over again, right? We just encounter it again and again and again, the most basic repetition. And that's extraordinarily important from a Jewish perspective. We keep coming back to it. Every year, right? This week's parsha is Shoftim. Every year we come to Shoftim. Every year we see it again and again and again. It's very, very important. And the other classic example of that is every time we complete a section of the Talmud, we recite this prayer that's known as the Hadran, right? And what it means is literally return. We finish a section of the Talmud and we immediately say, thank God we learned this thing. I can't wait to come back to it. I can't wait to come back around to it again. Because when it comes to Torah, what's central is that we return to it over and over again. It's a constant presence in our life. The same elements of it are a constant presence in our life. Right? And that's kind of also how it helps bridge between past and present, because it's always there. We keep coming to it, right? It's always part of our life. We can always find it there, whether it was 20 years ago or today. We're back at Parshat Shoftim again, right? And that sense of continuity, the repetition builds a sense of continuity between past and present. So for Rav Kook, this idea of over and over and over again is so important. And here's how he explains it to his son. He says, I don't find it now necessary to explain further the foundation of the matters that have already been explained. I see that you understand the matter according to your ability, even though there is no end to the level of understanding and the quality of understanding. For it is the foundation of the efforts of constant improvement, even in the old things that the ear has already absorbed well. He's already explained in this idea of chazara, of repetition, repeating your learning, keep coming back to it. And he's saying it's important not just for the parts that are difficult, because you might think, oh, I only got to review the things I don't understand so well. Rav Kook's saying it's equally important for the parts you actually do know really well. Might even be more important for the parts you know really, really well. And then he says, again, one of his famous lines, again, based on rabbinic midrash, but it's important that it's something very significant for Rav Kook. If you listen to the old, you will hear the new. If you listen to the old, you will hear the new. Because for Rav Kook, if you really pay attention to the old, to the tradition, if you keep coming back to it, you cannot help but see the possibilities for renewal within it. If you listen to the old, you'll hear the new. It's there if you listen hard enough. He goes on to say the current generation's illness hinges upon this point, right? This is the illness of his generation, and in many ways, it's the illness of our generation too. He says, of his generation, they believe that there's no need to learn that which is old, and they seek only the new, right? Modernity is all about the new. It's all about breaking from the past, because what's old is no longer necessary and it's outdated and it's wrong. So we got to go to something new, right? That's what it means to be a modern human being. Oh, this is like maybe the most American idea ever, particularly because America is maybe the most modern country ever. This idea that we just throw away the past to like only focus on the new, right? The American Revolution, get rid of the past, we're starting something new, right? America has this idea of every American's got to go like make it on their own, leave your home, go somewhere new, become a self-made man, right? This idea, again, forget about the past, focus on the new. But Rav Kook understands this is kind of an illness. Like we think it's a positive thing, innovation for its own sake, it's so wonderful, but there's a downside to this because in truth, you can't create something new out of nothing. The only way to create something new is from something old. And that's why Rav Kook says, if you want to hear the new, you got to listen to the old. So Rav Kook says they believe there's no need to learn that which is old and they seek only the new. In doing so, they find neither. They don't find the old or the new because they only focus on the new. Because the new can only be based upon what comes from an ancient source. It should be every day in the eyes of a thinker with a straight heart like new. Meaning if you're a true, deep spiritual thinker, you'll keep looking at the old and you'll keep finding new things into it. And he says here, this is citing from the Gemara, but I'll unpack what it means. It's a key line. The servant of God, the Eved Hashem, is the one who repeats that learning, that chapter 101 times. This applies to all learning. Therefore, my son, commit yourself to careful review and with this joy and eagerness so that you shall learn and be successful with the help of God. You got to learn, and you got to keep learning over and over again, even the parts you know, especially the parts you know, because that's the only way to hear the new. Don't think you can hear the new by running on the internet or going to, university or going to like where the cool people are at, right? The only way to find the new is in the old, because in truth, you can't create something new unless it's based on something old. Right? This is one of the great myths of innovation, that innovation means like something out of nothing. that's not true. It always has to come from something. You can't create unless you have raw materials. You can't create unless you already know the way things have been done, right? In order for you to be able to imagine a new way of doing things. But for our purposes, I want to focus on this statement here, that the Eved Hashem, the servant of God, is the one who's repeated the study of that chapter 101 times, because it's based on a Gemara in Chagiga. And what the Gemara says is, it basically says there are two, you can be a tzaddik, you can be a righteous person, but there's still a difference whether you've learned something 100 times or 101 times. If you learned 100 times, that's great, you're a tzaddik. But if you've learned 101 times, you're not only a tzaddik, you're an Eved Hashem, you're a servant of God. Right? There's something about that 101 time that just makes you at a different level, which again is kind of strange, right? And the Gemara itself even asks, come on, 101 versus 100, like what's the difference here? If you've learned 100 times, why isn't that an Eved Hashem? I'm not sure I've learned anything 100 times in my life. Anybody manages to do that, shouldn't they be an Eved Hashem? Why is it the 101th time that counts? And what the Gemara points out is that, again, learning isn't that simple. Oftentimes, it's that one extra learning that unlocks what you never saw before. And so what the rabbis are saying here about 101 is that it means whatever you think is the most, you have to go beyond that. You have to push at least once beyond that if you really want to be able to get at what is going on here. And that is very, very significant. And again, Rav Kook is getting at this idea of learning 101 times, and you got to keep going back to the old again and again and again. It's a sort of almost a compulsive attachment, because what it's showing is that it's so connected to you and you so are connected to it that you can't leave it alone. Right? I don't know if you've ever had a problem before that you just keep coming back to, you keep ruminating on it, you keep thinking about it over and over and over again, right? To the point where you just almost like, you can't escape it, right? That's supposed to be our relationship to learning, to Torah, that we just keep coming back to it. And not even just Torah in the broad sense, the same piece of Torah. You keep coming back to it again and again and again. Because only when you get to that 101 times, can you see the new possibilities within it. Because ultimately you can't live without Torah. Meaning if you're studying it 101 times, it's a part of you. You can't escape it. But it's only when you've gone that far, when you can't escape it, when it's part of you, that you can see the possibilities that are in it. Because in a sense, it's the repetition of the past that opens up the possibility of the future. It's the only when we keep coming back to the past, when we're so immersed in it, that it is part of us, then we can imagine how it can be different, but still the same. How we can imagine that it becomes new, but also holy, right? If you just sort of skim the past and try to change it, it's not good enough. Meaning, and this is, I think, significant, there are plenty of people who can find a biblical verse or a rabbinic text and offer some wonderful new interpretation of it and say, okay, I've got a new vision of Judaism. It's not hard to do that. Jewish text, Torah, is always open to interpretation. But Rav Kook is pointing out, it's not enough just to find a biblical verse. Secular Zionists were great at finding biblical verses they liked. But that's not exactly what Torah is in its fullness, right? Torah means the written Torah, means the oral Torah, it means the Mishnah, it means the Gemara, it means the Midrash, it means Chassidut, it means Kabbalah, it means taking all of Torah, right, and finding a way to make it new. Going through all of Torah 101 times and finding a way to see the possibilities in it that nobody ever saw before. Repetition means that something's also constantly open to interpretation. Right? When we say repeat it 101 times, it doesn't mean find the same meaning in it every time. If you're learning something 101 times compulsively, you can't escape it. I guarantee you're going to always find something new there, because that's exactly what draws you to it each time. The possibility that there's more there that you haven't seen before. The fact that the letters of Torah themselves point to God. That's what they are. They're not just given to us by God, right? In the rabbinic and the Kabbalistic mindset, they are from God. They are God in a sense. They are a gateway directly. God's presence is within those letters, at the very least between those letters. In fact, the repetition of learning that text over and over again, that Torah over and over again, is actually almost like a form of liturgy, because what also do we repeat all the time? Our tefillot. We repeat them 3 times a day, Shema twice a day, Amidah 3 times a day, Ashrei 4 times a day. Right? The tefillot are all about this liturgical repetition over and over and over again. Same words, same prayers, same places, same times. But that's what it means to be an Eved Hashem. And only when you're able to experience that can you see how the letters of Torah have something within it that you've never seen before. And what you're able to draw out of them is, I said, not something new that is disconnected from the past, but something new that is so deeply, authentically rooted in the past. Because when you've learned something 101 times, how could it be that what comes out of it isn't completely deeply rooted in it? So what does this mean for us, right? Remember I said this is so hard to make the old new and the new holy. So I think Rav Kook shows us how we think about this obsessive connection to Torah, this repetition that ultimately of the past, but one that ultimately points us towards the future. So I want to share a bit about how this is manifested in my own life, particularly with our own family past. This great grandfather of mine, Rabbi Shlomo Gross, in our Moon Kasher heritage. So over the years, I often found myself turning to the books of the Moon Kasher Hasidim, right? The Bnei Saschar is the first Moon Kasher Rebbe. That's the name of his most well-known book, the Bnei Saschar. It's a collection of essays on the holidays. And the reason I turned to it is because if the Bnei Saschar's Torah spoke so much to my great-grandfather, then maybe it could speak to me as well. And what was really fascinating, so I've been studying the Bnei Saschar's Torah over the years, and I would try to find ways to integrate it because, like I said, I wanted to connect to the past. I wanted to find a way to bring it into the present, even if I'm a Zionist and the Moon Kashers were not. But what was really interesting for me, and I think deeply profound, is earlier this year, my parents told me that visit that we had to Rabbi Steinberger all those years ago, they had actually recorded it. They had taken an audio recording of it because they're amazing that way, because they know you got to hold on to these things. And we were able to digitize it, and they sent it to me, and I had a chance to listen to it. And it was very profound. Several years younger than I am now in that recording, but he sounded just like my dad, which was like just fascinating to me. And in that recording, you're talking with the Rabbi Steinberger, our cousin, and learning more about the family. And one of the things Rabbi Steinberger shares is that he is in the midst of writing a Sefer Zichronot, a memorial book for those who died in the Holocaust from Munkash and the surrounding areas. Because remember, Rabbi Steinberger was a Holocaust survivor. And he felt this profound sense that he needs to record what was lost, the names, the places, the people, the communities. He feels it as a profound responsibility. And he does this because he knows if he doesn't write this down, those memories, those people will be lost a second time. It wasn't bad enough the Nazis killed them, right? Their memory will be lost as well if he doesn't write that down. So he takes this very, very seriously. And we actually have a copy of the book. It was published several years later. I have it on my bookshelf behind me. Unfortunately, it's in Yiddish, so it's not so easy for me to access. But he fulfilled what he wanted to do, which was to ensure that the past remained with us. And again, the act of writing it down preserves the past and its possibility of redemption in the future. And this is what was really fascinating to me. In the midst of the recording, my dad said something very profound. Not that it's beyond my father to do this, but it really, really struck me. Because when Rabbi Steinberger tells my parents that he's in the midst of writing this book and how important it is, my father completely agrees with him. And what my father says is as follows. He says, if there are books, there is hope. Someone will read it and remember it. The chain continues. We know this. You open the Talmud and they're still here. And again, what he's basically saying is that one can always redeem the voices of the past. And I love this line that my dad said, if there are books, there are hope, right? Because that's exactly what Rav Kook was getting at. If you have the old, and if you listen to the old, and if you keep listening to it so closely, you will hear the new. You will realize there is hope. There is a future. There's redemption, but you can't do it without the past. And as Rav Kook understood, you have to keep returning to the past over and over again, to the Torah, to be able to make it new and to be able to make it holy. After we made Aliyah these last 3 years, especially my kids are a little bit older now, we try to learn the Bnei Saschar Sfarim on Shabbat. And it's been very, very special that way. One or two of the Sfarim my great-grandfather is mentioned in, because what it does is allow me and my children to connect to our family past, right? To study the Torah of our family, essentially. And what it does is it serves as a bridge between my family's distant past and our present. And on some level, ultimately points us towards our future. Because when you study the Torah, someone's Torah, and you take it very seriously, it impacts you. So that Torah is with us, and that Torah is continuing to have an impact on us. So what I want to do as maybe the best example of Torat Eretz Yisrael that I can offer today in the spirit of Rav Kook, is I want to close with a piece from the Bnei Saschar again, the first Rebbe of Munkash, the one who inspired my great-great-great-grandfather, because perhaps we can turn his Torah into Torat Eretz Yisrael. Perhaps we can even make a Zionist out of him of sorts. So this essay that he wrote, the Bnei Yissaschar, and this particular essay is for Shavuot, about the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. But what he touches upon is this fascinating rabbinic text from Masechet Bava Metzia, from the Talmud. A text that asks, why were the Jewish people exiled from the land of Israel? Now, on the face of it, it's sort of a silly question. We know why the Jewish people were exiled from the land of Israel. They committed murder, idolatry, idol worship, right? It's all over the Nevi'im. We know this. So what exactly is this question referring to? Even the Second Temple, we have plenty of historical evidence. We know, the rabbis say, Sinat Chinam, the Jews turned on each other. We know why things ended so poorly. So what are the rabbis getting at when they ask this question? And what's interesting is they ask this question in multiple places and they give multiple answers. This answer is probably the strangest, but in some ways, I think it's maybe the most important to us today as Jews who have returned to the land of Israel. So the Gemara asks again, why is it that we lost the land of Israel? Why were we sent into exile? And what the Gemara says is this question's been raised or was stated. It's in relation to a verse from Jeremiah. Like, what does this verse mean? What is going on here? Why did we lose the land? The rabbis tried to understand it, but couldn't explain it. The prophets tried to understand it, they couldn't explain it. But eventually, the Ribono Shel Olam, God, was able to explain it. Kadosh Baruch Hu, and the verse is again this verse from Yirmiyahu that the Jewish people lost the land of Israel because the verse says, because they have forsaken my Torah, which I have set before them. That they've literally abandoned the Torah. Alazvam et Torati. They abandoned my Torah. That's why they lost the land of Israel. Right? A very, very powerful idea. And in fact, in other midrashim, it says that God says they can leave me, but they can't leave my Torah. They can leave me, but the moment they leave my Torah, they've lost no hope. They've lost all hope. Because as long as they have the Torah, they can find their way back to me. But if they lose the Torah, they're lost entirely. So this idea of having lost the Torah is very, very significant. But how did they lose the Torah? What does that mean? And here's how Gemara answers it. It says that they were exiled because they did not recite a blessing over the Torah before they studied Torah, right? Great sin, right? Like there's so many sins we could pick, right? This is the sin that caused us to lose the land of Israel because we didn't make a bracha, right? The bracha before Torah study. I mean, again, if I had to pick a bracha why we would have lost the land of Israel, I could come up with better ones. But the bracha before Torah study, what's the big deal here? What's going on? How are we supposed to understand this? And that's exactly what the Bnei Yissaschar wants to know. He finds this Gemara perplexing. He says, what the heck is going on here? Right? This doesn't make sense. Like, why would this be the sin? Why we lose the land of Israel? And even more so, like, why is this even a sin? Why would people stop making the bracha? It's not that big a deal. Like, there are many other sins people do because they potentially get some pleasure out of it. What's the pleasure out of not reciting this bracha? He doesn't understand it. So he wants to understand what's going on here. And he says something very, very interesting, something I believe Rav Kook could not have agreed with more. So here's how he explains it in the second paragraph here. He says, they did not listen to my voice and did not go in it. Again, this is a reference back to Yirmiyahu. It is explained that they, the Jewish people, did not make a blessing before studying Torah. The blessing of which is Asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato, right? That you, God, chose us from all the nations and you gave us your Torah, his Torah. And that's the first part of the bracha. And then the last part, it says, Baruch atah Hashem notena Torah. Blessed are you, God, who gives the Torah. And what the Bnei Yissaschar notes here is the shift in tense. It says God gave us the Torah in the past, but then the bracha also said God gives us the Torah in the present. So what's going on? So he says, in other words, God gives the Torah now and in every moment, right? Giving the Torah wasn't a one-time event. It happens in every moment. It happened just a few seconds ago, and it's happening right now. The revelation is always upon us. How do we know this? Because it says in the Torah itself, in Sefer Devarim, a great voice never to be repeated. Meaning when Moshe is describing the revelation of Har Sinai, he says there was a great voice never to be repeated. And what the rabbis understand, well, if the voice was never repeated, that means the voice never ended. Meaning God speaking at Har Sinai continues. And as it is translated, as it did not end by the Targum there. Right? And in fact, the rabbis say, Kol yom b'yom yotzei Bat kol me'ar chorev. Every day, a heavenly voice goes out from Sinai. Because, and so how is this possible? How is it the Torah is given in every moment? When one contemplates that in that voice, because when one contemplates in that voice and words in their wholeness, with a love of Torah that was already given, to understand its ways completely, even the simplest details of the law, a new Torah, from him it shall go forth. So just the English translation I wrote maybe doesn't capture the Hebrew perfectly. What he's saying here is, when you study Torah with intensity and passion, trying to get to the depths of its meaning, because you believe it has a message for you in the here and now, that it didn't just have a message for ancestors, the Torah is speaking to me right here, right now, God's speaking to me right here, right now. When you understand that, you try to understand what the Torah is telling you right here, right now, to its deepest details of every halacha. What does God want from you right now? When you approach Torah that way, then you get to hear God speaking to you in the here and now. Then the Torah is being given to you in the here and now. And it cites again this verse from Yeshayahu, Ki mitzian tetzei Torah, basically me'itai tetzei, that from God a new Torah shall go forth, because there's a new Torah present in every moment if we are able to look at the old Torah in the right way. He says, the Bnei Yissaschar, this does not occur when one doesn't strive to understand the depths of Torah in practice. One will not arrive to a comprehension of the secrets of Torah and the Holy Spirit. Meaning, if you don't study Torah to try to understand its depths and why it's relevant to you right here, right now, you can't experience a new revelation of Torah. And this is, I think, significant, because he's not necessarily speaking to academics, but if you study Torah in just a theoretical way, you cannot experience the Torah as a revelation in the here and now. Because it's just about trying to understand the big picture, trying to understand how the pieces fit together, trying to analyze it in the abstract. That's not good enough, right? It's when you believe the Torah has something to say to you right here, right now, how you should live your life, that's when you can discover and experience a new revelation of Torah. And this is how he understands what it meant when Jews didn't recite the blessing before the Torah, before they studied Torah. He says, in my opinion, this is the meaning of they did not bless before studying Torah. It doesn't mean they didn't bless at all. Meaning, he says, don't believe Chazal when they said they didn't make the blessing. They made the blessing, but they didn't really understand what they were saying. They didn't say it with the proper intention at all. Rather, they didn't strive to understand the meaning of the blessing of Torah. They didn't really get what they were saying and what its true meaning was. For it means that because God gave the Torah in the past, one merits to understand that God gives that Torah in the present, right? That's the chiddush of the bracha. That's the point, right? This is Rav Kook's whole argument. The old will become new and the new will become holy. That's what the revelation of Torah is all about. But that can only come when you approach Torah with an openness and a receptiveness that God is speaking to you through it right here, right now. And he goes on to say, this is the meaning of they did not listen to my voice. Right? When it says the Jewish people didn't listen to the voice of God, they abandoned the Torah. They abandoned the realization that the Torah demands that it's speaking to us right now. That's why we got to keep coming back to it every moment. Not 100 times, but 101 times, because God's there every time. God's speaking to us every time. We got to keep going back to it to hear it. And by listening to the old, of course, we'll hear the new, because God continues to speak each day and in every moment. So look, for me, this message is so central for Zionism, for religious Zionism, because we're back in the land of Israel, right? And the question becomes, how are we going to stay here? How are we going to ensure that our return is ultimately a redemptive return for the Jewish people and for beyond? And this is a dilemma Rav Kook understood. He was profoundly optimistic about the Jewish return to the land of Israel. But again, our ability to dwell in this land and not only survive here, but to thrive is dependent on the Torah. And it's not just dependent on the Torah because that's the tradition and our identity, and we have to hold on to it because it's important. And if we lose our identity, that's a problem. No, it's because if we lose our connection to the Torah, we lose the realization that God is speaking to us in the here and now. And that is the challenge of Torat Eretz Yisrael. That's that challenge of creating a redemptive Torah, a Torah that shines its light in the darkness and draws people to it. It's the challenge of, as I said, going to the past and going back to it over and over again to the tradition, not because you want to be fixated within the tradition as it is forever, not because it can't change, because it can change and it will change, but it only can do that if you go over it over and over and over again, if you can't escape it, because only then can you realize the new possibilities within it. You can make the old new and the new holy, and that's what Torat Eretz Yisrael is all about. That's the Torah that Rav Kook dreamed about. That's the kind of Torah that will make sure that Israel is a source of light for all to see. And it's that Torah of the land of Israel that's been a light in my life for many years now. Fourth, when I first came here, and it's light, and it was the light that in the darkness draw me to it and my family to it once again. And for that, I'm very, very forever grateful. And I feel it's, that's my job, is like, how do we keep turning to the past, turning to Torah, finding a way for my wife and my children and our own Torah of our own family to make the old new and the new holy. Because Rav Kook understood, I'm not sure you can encapsulate Judaism in a more efficient and elegant fashion than those words.